On behalf of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, I wish you all very welcome to this prize lecture in economic sciences. Questions about the causes and effects of international trade are among the classic fields in economic research. What determines trade patterns? Are there wealth or gains from trade? Who gains and who loses from trade? Some 200 years ago, Ricardo developed his theory of comparative advantage, which explains trade in terms of differences in technology among countries. And in the 1920s, the two Swedish economists, Heckscher and Bertolini, developed their theory that explains trade in terms of differences in relative access to package of production, such as capital and labor. The common element between Ricardo's theory and the Heckscher-Will theory is that trade occurs when countries differ with respect to technologies or factor proportions. But in the real world, world trade is dominated by flows between countries that are similar. A large proportion of trade also involves goods of the same type. The car industry is an obvious example. Trying to explain such phenomena in terms of differences in technologies or factor endowments seems far-fetched. In 1979, Paul Krugman presented a new theory of international trade that explains trade in similar products between countries with identical characteristics. One key assumption is that there are economies of scale in production, so that goods can be produced more cheaply in long series. Another assumption is that consumers appreciate variety in their consumption. Trade makes it possible to replace small-scale production for a local market with large-scale production for a world market, in which firms with different brands compete with each other. Krugman's model was highly influential. The new trade theory provided a whole new picture of the benefits of free trade. His 39 paper also sowed the seed for a new theory of economic geography, a theory that he developed 12 years later. The new theory helps us to understand rapid worldwide urbanization. As earlier, Krugman assumed economies of scale and that consumers appreciate variety in consumption. But he also adds a new dimension, namely labor mobility between different regions. Highly populated regions are attractive because they offer a richer choice of different goods. Firms too have incentives to locate in highly populated regions, since they can thereby keep down transport costs and benefit from economies of scale. A self-reinforcing process may arise with migration to cities, making possible greater economies of scale and thereby further reinforcing the attractiveness of cities. Krugman shows that the end result may be a concentration of most activity in one or two regions. The exact outcome depends on the interactions among transport costs, economies of scale, and consumer demand. Paul Krugman was born 1953 in New York, and he earned his PhD from MIT in 1977. He has taught at Yale, Stanford, and MIT before joining Princeton University, where he is Professor of Economics and International Affairs since the year 2000. He received the John Bates Clark Medal from the American Economic Association in 1991. In wider circles, Paul Krugman is well known for his twice-weekly column in the New York Times, as well as for a large number of other contributions to policy debates. Professor Krugman, you have now the floor for your prize lecture.
In this lecture, I want to be in part a little retrospective, talk about the creation of these theories, but I also thought it should be a bit more than that, and talk to some extent about the relevance of these theories to what's happening now, and particularly some of the pressing problems we're having actually in parts of the world even now. Of course, recent events are dominated by a financial crisis, but there's also a real source of the problems that has, I think, a fair bit to do, although in a perverse way, which I'll explain, with some of the issues that I and others spent much of the past quarter century working on. So let me spend a little while. Actually, here's an outline of where I intend to go. Let me first talk about why we needed this theory, why we needed to change the way we thought about international trade, and then talk about how that, through a kind of inexorable logic, leads you to think differently about the geography of production within countries as well as trade. And then I'll try to talk about what's happening. And the everything old is new again. I'll explain what that's about when we get there. So let me start by talking about trade as it was thought about for about 160 years after David Ricardo's classic analysis. How economists thought about trade, how it was certainly taught when I was in graduate school. And it was a story about countries trading because they were different. The classic case was wheat and wine, Britain selling wheat to Portugal and importing wine in return, climate differences, but of course it could be differences in technological competence, could be differences in resources, the skill level of your labor force, or the amount of capital that you had accumulated. And that theory, of course, remains an important story about world trade today. If you go back to the early years of the 20th century, it was a very good story about trade as a whole. So if we want long-term perspective, let's just look at what Britain's trade looked like on the eve of World War I. What did Britain do? Well, it exported manufactured goods. The non-manufactured included a fair bit of coal. It imported food and some manufactured goods, but they were generally very primitive manufacturers. Only a few things imported that were sophisticated manufactured goods. And the story about Britain was it was the workshop of the world. It was skilled in manufacturing. It had a competence in that. It had a comparative advantage in manufacturing. And it, on the other hand, it was short on land, short on raw materials, so it imported raw materials. Very much a classical view of trade, comparative advantage, no problem. This is the kind of trade that economic models understood very easily. But if we go forward around 80 years to the 1990s, well, Britain basically exported manufactured goods and imported manufactured goods. You might say, well, there must be a clear difference between the types of goods that Britain exported and the type that it imported. But actually, not so much. Automobiles, not such a good example right now because no one is actually selling any automobiles. But two-way trade in automobiles between countries, two-way trade in machine tools, a remarkable amount of two-way trade. And I'll show you a bit more on that in a second. Very lack of a clear pattern. Very much importing and exporting the same kinds of goods. Also, there was a change in the countries with whom Britain traded. So this is a comparison, again, circa 1910 and by the 1990s. ROW is rest of the world, sorry, economist abbreviations. So if we looked at 1910, Britain, although it did trade with other European countries, actually the bulk of its trade was with places further afield. Its trade was with India for tea, with the United States or Canada for wheat. It was a trade of countries that had different climates or very different abundances of land or differences in natural resources. There was a kind of trade between complementary countries, was the way the world worked. But if we look now, Britain primarily exports to its European neighbors. And its European neighbors are, from an economist's point of view, virtually indistinguishable from Britain. Same level of technological competence, same education level of the workforce. Basically, trading with countries that are very much like yourself. If I expanded this to include trade with other high-income countries, it would be the vast bulk of Britain's trade. Although a little bit less now than it was 15 years ago, and that's actually an important story. These are very informal measures. We can get more formal. As it happens, the this year's World Development Report from the World Bank is focused on economic geography. And they have some very useful summary measures. The first one to show here is the rise of intra-industry trade. The measure being shown here, the Gruber-Lloyd Index, is a measure of the extent to which trade is actually matched exchanges of products within the same industry. So if industry by industry, the amount you imported and the amount you exported was exactly the same, the Gruber-Lloyd Index would be 1. If what you exported and what you imported were completely distinct, you export clothing and you import automobiles, it would be 0. It's done at the 5-digit level, which means that we're talking about fairly narrowly defined industries. And yes, that top line is high-income countries trading with each other. Half of their trade is matched trade within these quite disaggregated industries. Very much countries importing and exporting the same goods. You can also see, by the way, that it increased dramatically over the course of the 1960s, and then again somewhat in the 80s. But this rapid increase in the 60s, and in fact, that rapid increase in the 60s reflected several events that shook up people who were paying close attention to the empirics of international trade. It included the formation of the common market, what eventually became the European Union, which was a very brave thing to take down the trade barriers between European countries, because it was widely expected that this would lead to substantial industrial restructuring. It was expected that some industries would grow in France and shrink in Germany, and vice versa, which would be painful politically, possibly derailing the project. What actually happened instead was that France and Germany began exporting a great deal to each other, but more or less the same stuff. There was hardly any change in the industrial composition of employment in the countries as a result. And you can see that in that rapid increase in intra-industry trade. Same thing on a more limited scale between the United States and Canada, which had a free trade pact in automobiles beginning in the 1960s. And there was widespread fear, particularly among the Canadians, that their auto industry would disappear. What actually happened was a huge increase in trade in automobiles and automotive products between the United States and Canada, but roughly balanced, and no particular change in employment between the two countries. The other thing, which is rather striking in this new World Bank study, and is again confirming the intuition I gave you from the British numbers, is that we used to have world trade dominated by going to faraway countries that had what you did not, and did not have what you did. But over time, world trade has become largely a matter, not entirely of course, but largely a matter of countries trading with neighbors, countries not too far away, and very similar stuff going back and forth. By the way, this is not what people imagine. People have the idea that world trade used to be that you only dealt with in your neighborhood, and that long distance world trade is what's new. Actually, that's not true. The British were getting their wheat from Argentina and their mutton from New Zealand a century ago. What is new is the amount of stock being hauled back and forth to some extent between China and Europe, but to a large extent between nearby countries. And so this is a measure of the extent to which trade between countries falls off with distance. It actually comes out of a gravity equation, which I'll mention without ever writing one down in another couple of minutes. But what's interesting is that actually trade has become more sensitive to distance over time, not less so. That doesn't mean that faraway countries are doing less trade. What it means is that nearby countries are doing vastly more trade than they ever used to do. And this is, again, that's Britain once upon a time was trading with its empire or a few colonies that sort of broke away. And now Britain largely trades with its European neighbors. Okay, what's all this about? Why is this all happening? Well, there was a problem. People looked at this and said, how do these trends, which were fairly visible, how do they fit in with this model of trade that we have, which says the countries trade because they're different? Well, a few people, mostly empirical economists, not trying very hard to have a model, had an answer, and they basically said, let's think about what Adam Smith had to say. There is a new 20-pound note in Britain, which is an Adam Smith note. And on the back is, of course, the portrait of Adam Smith and a picture of the pin factory. The pin factory, which is described in the beginning of The Wealth of Nations, which talks about the enormous increase in productivity that you get from producing a lot of pins and having each man specialize in doing something different. Economies of scale, the advantages of large-scale production. And in fact, it wasn't really very hard to look at what happened, for example, in the North American Auto Pact of 1964. What happened was the Canadian auto industry was a miniature of the U.S. industry, same company, same union, but at 1/10 the scale. And what happened when the trade barriers were brought down was that industry specialized in a much narrower range of products and exported those products and imported products from the United States in return, the things it was no longer producing, with a gain in productivity, gain in efficiency. Say, well, that's easy enough. Surely that must be in the trade models. But it wasn't. And the reason it wasn't was because there becomes a real problem if you're trying to think in terms of conventional, certainly the way economics was done 30 years ago, which was almost entirely in terms of perfect competition, in terms of firms that take prices as given, set pricing with a marginal cost. Because if you're in a pin factory world, if you're in this kind of world where the larger the scale, the lower your average cost, then your marginal cost must always be below your average cost. Marginal cost pricing is not going to be possible because if you set pricing with a marginal cost, you're always going to be losing money. And in fact, in a world of increasing returns, perfect competition has to break down. It has to be some kind of imperfect competition, perhaps monopoly, but it certainly can't be perfect competition. So there was a real problem of market structure. This new movement in trade and in later in geography came really starting with innovations in the theories of industrial organization, where people began producing simple models that would let you think about imperfect competition in I almost want to say a sanitized fashion. Ways that did not require you to think a lot about the issues of strategy, gains, coordination, potential for price fixing, antitrust, all the things that come up in imperfectly competitive markets, but instead just focus on the fact that everybody's got a little bit of monopoly power. Nobody's actually taking prices as given. Simultaneously, independently, several of us in the trade area, Victor Norman in Bergen, Kelvin Lancaster at Columbia, and myself, said, hey, we can use these industrial organization models to start thinking about international trade, and that it will mesh with the concerns, the real-world concerns about explaining why world trade patterns don't look the way the classical models say they should look. What was involved was not so much actually a technically hard thing, although there certainly was technical work involved. What was required really was a shift of attitude. Some years later, I wrote down my rules for research based on the experience of producing, and these were the rules. Listen to the Gentiles. There were a lot of people saying, this story about trade that everyone tells in economics is not right. You guys are missing the point. But they, by and large, were non-economists, or if they were economists, they didn't seem to have a very good command of standard economic theory. They were not talking in terms of the kind of button-down models that economists like. They were not of our tribe. And one thing that I think that lesson was, listen, people may not be using your language, may not be using your concept, but it's still, they may have something very valuable to say, and you should pay attention. Questioning the question. And maybe stumbling block. I lost about a year to this. Was thinking that your model of trade had to tell you why any particular good is produced in any one country. You need to have a story that is going to, you need to have a model that's going to step by exactly who produces what. Turns out that the natural approach to this is one that focuses on broad patterns, that allows some randomness, or at least indeterminacy, in who produces exactly what. You don't need to ask why are Peugeots produced in France and Volkswagen produced in Germany. What you need to know is that different models of car are produced in France and Germany. And if you're willing to say, hey, hey, that's the question you need to answer, not the question of why is a particular car produced in a particular place, then amazing amount of difficulty just boils away. Daring to be silly. Economics has assumptions which are never quite true. This is always what we do. Whatever assumptions have been used by many people over many years come to seem natural. So perfect competition seems to seem like a natural assumption. And then in terms of trade theory, if you were doing perfect competition, from there on, your model could be fairly general. You didn't have to make a lot of special assumptions. To do this kind of work in trade, you have to do, you could go away from perfect competition, which is fundamentally an unreasonable assumption, but you have to make some very special assumptions about the nature of products. You have to assume some symmetry to make things attractive to be able to think about. You have to assume functional forms. There are things that you have to do that seem silly to people who are accustomed to the generality of the conventional trade models. Except that the generality was the experience. The generality was generality given the big unreasonable assumptions up front. And you needed to say, hey, look, what is, silliness is in the eye of the beholder, and if we're getting something useful out of this alternative approach, that's the way to go. And then, simplify. These were difficult concepts. They don't seem so difficult now, but they were, and it was really important to bring things down to a level where you understood it, let alone your readers. So it was really important to do. And what we got from all of that was a very, in the end, compelling, simple story about the pattern of trade. It's a pattern that, now this goes back to work that Elton and I do in our 1985 book. We liked this picture. It was a picture of a two-sector economy. That's not what we're actually doing in those diagrams, the real-world charts I showed you, which are down to five-digit levels. So we're actually talking about thousands of sectors. But this gives you a picture. You get a picture where there's a lot of trade back and forth, even within similar products. That's the manufacturer side, because the two countries are producing different things, even though it's broadly similar, even though it's the same industry. They're producing different things because there are economies of scale. It doesn't pay for any one country to produce all of them. And the overlap within that sector is intra-industry trade. On the other hand, old-fashioned comparative advantage is still there. Countries that have a lot of oil, even if they are also manufacturing producers, are going to import less oil. They may export oil. There will be all kinds of reasons why underlying differences also lead to trade. Countries that have highly skilled labor forces will, on average, tend to export skill-intensive products. But they will probably also import some skill-intensive products. So that you'll actually have a combination of intra-industry and inter-industry trade. Coming out very naturally from the analysis is that the balance between those two is going to depend on how different the countries are. Countries that are very different are going to be trading primarily for comparative advantage reasons, and therefore going to look more like sole inter-industry trade. Countries that are very similar will be basically doing intra-industry trade. Always a slight problem, which is industries as defined by government statistics may not correspond very well to industries as defined by your economic concepts. There's been some effort to try and rearrange the statistics to do that. So my favorite industry always in standard international trade classifications was materials sent through the post office, not elsewhere classified. Even with a lot of cleaning up, it works very well. And I won't go back to the figure, but the advanced countries trading with each other, primarily we're doing the inter-industry trade, which is exactly what the theory predicts. So we have this very nice story about trade. How does this get to economic geography? Well, the starting point, I'm sorry, let me take that second to just say that I meant to say there has been a lot of work continuing since this was basically laid out. Three things to mention. The return of gravity doesn't mean that I've been in orbit lately. There's an extremely good empirical relationship in world trade that says that the trade between any two countries depends on the size of their economies and the distance between them. And that's known as a gravity equation. One of the things that was problematic in economics was that gravity equations worked very well in practice, but not in theory. That there was no good justification. These models, where countries produce differentiated products within industries, where even countries that are producing the same mix of goods are in fact specialized in producing different goods within those, lead quite naturally to gravity-type equations. And so one of the effects, which has been very important for many other fields with subfields within international economics, has been that the new trade theory legitimized gravity, made it so we knew what we were doing when we estimated gravity equations. The style of analysis that I just described, where you think about aggregative outcomes, don't think hard about exactly why is this product produced there, but rather about the overall pattern of trade between countries. Turns out to be useful even if you're not doing increasing return. And so there's a very important line of work, which is much more classical trade theory, but by John Eaton and Sam Corbin, which uses sort of the style of the new trade theory model, but applies it to a different set of principles. And very important in recent years. In perfectly competitive trade models, wheat and wine, firms have no real existence. It's all atomistic. They're all peasants producing the same product. These models at least open the way to think about what the role of firms is. And it turns out that there are striking patterns at the level of the individual firm in trade. Firms that export are much more productive than firms that do not export. They pay different levels of wages. And although the models that I worked on 25 years ago had firms all identical, the same approach lends itself to thinking about firms that are not identical, and then you have a whole rich set of data to exploit, and a very different view now, it turns out, about what trade does. One of the things that trade does, it turns out, is to cause the more productive firms to expand, the less productive firms to contract. And one of the major effects of trade is the effect on productivity within industries because of different firms. And I'm mentioning Mark Nellis, my colleague at Princeton, because he had one of the seminal papers in this field. Geography. The direction towards economic geography began with one of the issues that arose in trade. There was a famous, it's kind of a funny thing, there was a famous book by Stefan Burenstam-Linder, Swedish economist, called An Essay on Trade and Transformation, published in 1961, in which he argued that countries tend to export goods for which they have large domestic markets. And this came to be known as the Linder hypothesis, which I understand was ignorance. That's exactly Burenstam-Linder, but anyway. And it was one of those funny things that every economics course, every graduate economics course, would simultaneously trash the Linder hypothesis and teach it. Trash it because it didn't make any sense, but on the other hand, somehow it felt like it ought to be right, and everybody was, and there was some evidence for it. It felt that this whole trade has this counterculture. Always, people who would say that everything you do in your models is wrong, and it was always out there. And again, my listening to the Gentiles business, and so the Linder effect was something that was always out there, nagging at people like an itch you couldn't scratch. You knew that this was somehow something there, but how did it work? So actually, one of the first things I did after getting into this field was to say, okay. Let's think about the Linder hypothesis. And I had a very clear intuition, namely that it was wrong. There was nothing to it. And I sat down to take the style of model and work it out and say, let's prove that we do not actually get a home market effect in these models. Turns out, this is why doing your math is good. It turns out that after about 2 days of work, I said, my God, it's right. There actually is a home market effect. One of the things about this, it turns out, is that you can do this, to do it right is surprisingly painful. But there is a cheat sheet way of doing home market effects, which is helpful, especially when we get to geography in a minute. So let me just actually do a little algebra here. Very little algebra. We think of S being the amount of sales, the number of things that you sell in each of two markets. And right away we say, wait, doesn't the price matter? Forget about prices. when we think of a single firm, which is deciding whether to have a plant in only one country or a plant in both countries, and there's some cost, fixed cost to opening the plant. There's also some transport cost per unit. There are two things you might want to do, and right away you can get the home market. If you want to have only one plant, then you want to put it in the market, in the country with the larger market, and export to the other, because that's going to minimize your transport costs. So, do I want to do that? And it's going to depend upon the relative size of the market, the fixed cost, and the transport cost. I like to think of it as there's some product that you're only going to have one factory producing it, and it can be either in New York or Chicago. You're going to want to put it in New York, which is a bigger market there, and sell it to Chicago. The obvious point, and this is the old joke about the professor who says, obviously then goes silent for 20 minutes and says, I was right, it was obvious. In this case, it actually took more than a decade before I saw the obvious point, was that once you start to think in terms of these market size effects, there's an obvious possibility if people and firms can move, that large markets attract production, but attracting production enlarges the size of the market. The possibility of a circular process that leads to agglomeration. But also, since it's not necessarily the case that you're going to concentrate production in only one location, it's a process that does not have to happen. That, given the right conditions, you get a process of agglomeration, but not always. This is now we all economists have noticed that there are cities. This happened a while back, but they tended to explain concentrations of production by simply assuming that there were some kind of positive spillovers between firms. So this leading to the caustic remark by a physicist at one interdisciplinary conference that economists say that firms agglomerate because of agglomeration economies, which is not very helpful. Here you can actually think about how they're derived. We're not assuming that there's some invisible spillover between firms. We're talking about size of market, transport costs, economies of scale, things that are much more mundane, down to earth, and yet interact in really interesting ways. And even a bit more modeling, and again, this is cheating. To do this right, you actually have to do quite a lot more than I'm doing here, but the cheating gets to the point. Think about it. This is the core periphery model I did. Think about there's some overall market, some fraction, mu, that market is actually accounted for by workers who themselves work for firms that might move to the best location in the market. Again, have some transport costs, have some fixed costs. Ask the question, guess that all of the workers who can move have concentrated in one location. That's still going to leave 1 minus B over 2 times the overall market size of customers in the other market. If it's worth it for firms to open a second plant to serve that market, then actually that concentration of workers that we've guessed at can't actually happen. It won't sustain itself. But if there is a sufficiently large economy of scale or some other factors that cause firms, in fact, to choose to stay in the market where everybody else has chosen to locate, then you have a self-sustaining concentration of production. And you can see in that equation the inequality down there at the bottom. If fixed costs relative to the size of the market, basically economies of scale, are large relative to an expression that includes transport costs and is negatively affected by the share of workers that are footloose, basically by how much of stuff is not tied to a particular location by natural resources, then you will have a concentration of activity in one location. Which location? Actually, if it's really symmetric, that the model won't tell you. But it tells you that if for some reason the industry is concentrated or gets a head start in one location, it will stay there. Now, okay, that's just theory. It turns out to be a particular case. There are actually many cases of this. So if you look at the geography of the world, look at certainly in the United States, to a lesser extent Europe, what you see is a highly concentrated population, the vast majority of people living on a very small part of the land area, and living in great belts of population and urbanization. So that where I live is part of an 80 million person belt of cities along the east coast of the United States. Why are we there? Not really because of the climate or the beauty of the landscape. Hard to see the landscaping under the shopping mall, and much of it. Each of us is there because the other 80 million people are there. Self-reinforcing agglomeration of people. We can see when this started to happen. And it's a very specific event in U.S. history, which is the emergence of the U.S. manufacturing belt. So I went back and found a nice picture from an old article, American Economic Review. These are cities that had more than 10% of their population employed in manufacturing. 10% because they said, look, the author said that even a city that is basically not at all a manufacturing city, there's going to be some stuff that's manufacturing. So he set a criteria. And what you can see is, leaving aside, there are some small textile towns in the southeastern United States. The great bulk of the stuff, as of 1929, was in this area, running from New England across to the inner Midwest, the manufacturing belt. And if you stylize where it was, it looked like this. This is the American manufacturing, the classic American manufacturing belt. The line that people used to use was, within the manufacturing belt, farms exist to serve the cities. Outside it, cities exist to serve the farms. Very clear differentiation. This was the American manufacturing core. I'm saying was. You'll see why I'm saying that in a minute. When did this happen? And how did it happen? Well, it's actually pretty much, this is an economic geographer's paper, Meyer's paper on manufacturing belt. Basically, manufacturing, as of 1929, in fact, as of 1960, manufacturing in the United States is where manufacturing was in 1860. The frontier moved west, farms spread west, the economy, the frontier didn't close until 1890. The center of population continued to shift west to this day, but manufacturing froze where it was in 1960. As you said, if you hadn't developed an industrial cluster, an industrial system by 1860, you didn't have one 100 years later. What happened circa 1850, 1860? Well, think of that criteria in my cheap shot version, but the same thing pops up in the real version of the core periphery analysis. If economies of scale are large, that tends to foster concentration. Birth of the factory system, birth of large-scale production, taking place just about at this moment. If transport costs are low, you tend to be concentrated. Well, this is the growth of the railroad network. Before that, you have to have industrial cities moving west with the agricultural frontier because it was too expensive to ship things long distance. And the more stuff that is footloose, the more stuff that is not tied to particular locations by natural resources or land, the more likely to be located in a concentrated location. So, and of course we had industrialization. This is when we started our move away from being a mostly agricultural country. So, in fact, what we see in the formation of this manufacturing belt is kind of a phase transition. It's like reducing the temperature of water to the point where stuff freezes out, and we froze out the manufacturing. It stopped where it was in 1860. Same kind of thing happens, but with more detail, more complexity in the models. If we're trying to think about the location of particular industries, and there's a great deal of regional specialization. Happens, by the way, you can see it happening now in China. There's a pajama town. There are different kinds of toy towns. There's a stocking town in the industrial region of China. But in the United States, this happened a long time ago. It happened mostly in the late 19th century. Formation of specializations in industry at various locations, and we'll try to go through the modeling here, but to say that it's the same kind of analysis. Very striking feature of the landscape, because we didn't talk about much in economics until We started to have models to do it. And a dramatic differentiation of regions in the United States. The origins of particular clusters of industry tended to be historical accidents. There was filled gold was invented by a late 18th century American inventor. And to this day, the costume jewelry industry is located near Providence, Rhode Island, where he did that. Everybody's favorite, although it's a late example, the U.S. carpet industry is concentrated around the town of Dalton, Georgia. And there's a chain of events that leads to that begins with a teenage girl making a tufted bedspread as a wedding gift in 1895, giving rise to a local handicraft industry, which there are these wonderful stories. And of course, everybody's most famous agglomeration now is Silicon Valley, which is because two guys named Hewlett and Packard started a business in their garage. So we have all of these localizations. This is from work by Kim and Margot, who did looked at, they using a measure that comes from some of my own work, to look at regional specialization in the United States. It's interesting, as you can see, this dramatic differentiation of regions, which sort of peaks in the 1920s. It's actually come down since then. There's always a temptation in economics to think that the latest wrinkle in economic theory must be the latest wrinkle in the way the world works. To think that because you've made an intellectual advance, that must be the way the world is going. If we look at this regional stuff, it actually looks as if the world is going away. It's actually becoming less new geography and more classical. Trade too. Not quite as dramatic in the kinds of numbers I was showing you before, but the big increase in trade in recent years, especially since the mid-1990s, has been north-south trade, has been trade in manufactured goods. So this is U.S. imports of manufactured goods as a share of GDP from developed countries, rich countries, which have been flat, and imports of manufactured goods from poor countries, which have gone up spectacularly. And it turns out the biggest increases have been from the countries which are most different from the United States, the low-wage countries. Not South Korea now, but China, Mexico, very low-wage countries. In a way, we're going back to a more classical pattern of trade. The story is not that increasing returns have lately become important. The story was they were enormously important. The world we thought you knew was very much shaped by increasing returns. The world in which manufacturing was largely restricted to advanced countries. The world in which the complex of auto production around Detroit dominated the world. That was the world we grew up in. That's the world that's actually dissolving now. Manufacturing is not in a good way in advanced countries right now, certainly not in the United States. And particularly the kinds of manufacturing that has really good jobs. We're seeing increasing inequality. We're seeing a decline of good jobs. The increasing inequality certainly has something to do with the growing imports of manufactured goods from low-wage countries. Now, we've all done a lot of work trying to figure out how big that effect is. It's actually getting hard because of the subtlety of modern trade, but it's certainly a factor. It's also been, I think we can say that the changing geography of production within advanced countries has become an important factor. So we're having, hopefully, as we speak, they're hammering out a temporary bailout of the big three U.S. automakers. And everybody talks, there's a lot of special factors in there. There's the special factors of grossly bad management, legacy costs of workers. It's also very important to realize that the big three automakers are in fact a legacy of the days when this manufacturing belt was the core of the U.S. economy. And that manufacturing belt is dissolving. Has been dissolving really since about 1965 or so, but in the case of autos, very much so recently. So that here's a picture from a recent analysis done for the Chicago Fed of the changing geography of the U.S. auto industry. Now we have the big three, the old auto companies, and we have a new auto industry which is growing up, which is largely transplants, foreign firms, Japanese, European. The old auto industry is all in the manufacturing belt, very much centered around Detroit. The new plants, which pay lower wages, don't offer health benefits, are elsewhere. Part of the reason they're able to go elsewhere is that we start to look at the underlying factors that led to the creation of the manufacturing belt. In the first place, they've gotten weaker. The incentives, the agglomeration that required that you be where the old auto industry was, are much weaker now than they used to be. And so the auto industry, as it was, is dissolving. And if you look at the job losses, the new auto industry, the one that's not in the manufacturing belt, has actually been holding up pretty well, although ask about it next year, but has actually held up relatively well. But the traditional Midwestern industrial manufacturing belt industry is the one that's taking the big losses. By the way, if anybody saw I said something about this yesterday, and it was completely garbled by the reporters at the press conference. So this is what I would actually say. It's not that the U.S. auto industry is disappearing, but that the traditional clustering in the manufacturing belt is falling apart. So it's interesting. If we actually were to think about what does the increase in recurrence say, I think about current events, it's not that we're moving to a world more and more dominated by the forces of the new trade theory and the new economic geography. It's actually the reverse. The world you thought you knew was actually not at all a world of classical economics and standard trade theory. It was a world, in fact, where these circular logic, the forces of increasing returns, market size, agglomeration were very, very powerful. We're actually becoming, arguably, a world in which those things are less powerful. And that is the force of change. That's the thing that's making things very difficult for the manufacturing sector. Don't want to end this on a down note. Obviously, we have many things happening that are very disturbing in some places, but the real thing is simply how much better we're able to understand what's happening now. We went from a beautiful theory of world trade that missed at least half the story to something that is, I believe, much, much closer to making sense of this world, and perhaps even to helping us get through the transition now happening with a little bit less damage than might otherwise have taken place.